I work at a factory cutting wood. The job isn't fancy, but it gets the bills paid. Sometimes I get sent out to cut trees deep in the woods. It's tough work, but I've always liked being in the forest. There's something calming about the quiet and the steady rhythm of chopping wood. Last month, a client hired us to clear part of a forest so they could build a new road. The spot was far out, away from any main roads or towns. It was one of those jobs where you're on your own. They offered extra pay since no one else was going, so I took it. I drove my truck down a narrow dirt road that wound deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees grew so close together that their branches blocked most of the sunlight. It felt like I was entering a place people hadn't been to in years. I had a map that showed an old cabin nearby, which I planned to use as my base for the week. When I found the cabin, it was what I expected. Small and falling apart. The wood was rotting, the door hung crooked, and the windows were dirty. Inside, there was one room with a stove, a table, and a bed that creaked when I sat on it. It smelled like damp wood and old dust. There was no electricity, just an oil lamp sitting on the table. I unpacked my stuff and settled in, trying to ignore how empty and quiet the place felt. The first day went fine. I worked all day, cutting and stacking logs. The forest was full of sounds: birds, rustling leaves, the distant creak of branches. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was wiped out. I ate a quick meal from a can, lit the oil lamp, and fell asleep almost right away. On the second night, something woke me up. It was faint, like footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound wasn't quick or random. It was slow, steady, like someone walking. I stayed in bed, listening until the noise stopped. The next morning, I looked around the cabin. There were no tracks, no signs of anything. I shook it off and went back to work, but the feeling of being watched stuck with me all day. That night, the sound came back. This time, the footsteps circled the cabin. I sat up in bed, holding my axe, listening to the slow crunch of leaves outside. They stopped at the door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but after a while, they faded into the forest. The next morning, something was off. My axe, which I'd left leaning against the cabin, was gone. In its place was a bundle of sticks tied together with some kind of string. It didn't make sense. My hands shook as I grabbed the sticks and threw them into the woods. I felt like I was being warned, but I didn't know by who or what. I decided to leave the next morning, even though the job wasn't done. That night, I couldn't sleep. The footsteps came back, louder than before, stomping through the leaves. I lit the oil lamp and sat on the edge of the bed, gripping a knife. The steps stopped at the door again. Then I heard a scraping sound, slow and steady, like something being dragged across the wood outside. When the sun finally came up, I packed my stuff as fast as I could. I stepped outside and froze. The ground around the cabin was covered in bundles of sticks, arranged in a circle. My truck was just outside the line, untouched. I didn't think twice. I threw my gear in the back and drove off, heart pounding. I didn't stop driving until I was far from the forest. When I told the client I couldn't finish the job, they didn't seem surprised. They asked if I'd heard about the cabin's history. Years ago, a woman had lived there alone, cutting and selling wood. One winter, she vanished. People said she'd gone mad from the isolation, but no one ever found her. I don't know if someone was out there messing with me, or if something from the past was still lingering in those woods. But the thought that someone or something was watching me the entire time makes my skin crawl. When I dream about it now, I don't see the cabin or the sticks. I see the forest, stretching endlessly, dark and silent. And in that silence, I can still hear the footsteps. It was late December, and the snow wouldn't stop falling. My fiancée, her mom, and I had planned a weekend at a cabin her family owned, tucked away deep in the woods. At first, it sounded perfect, quiet, cozy, and a good way to spend the holidays together. But as the snow kept coming down, what started as peaceful quickly became uneasy. By the second day, we were completely snowed in. The road that led to the cabin was buried under so much snow it was impossible to see, let alone use. Walking out wasn't even an option. We weren't too worried, though. The cabin had plenty of food, firewood, and everything we thought we'd need. We figured the storm would end soon, and we'd head home after that. That evening, the wind was loud enough to rattle the windows, and the temperature felt like it had dropped even more. I decided to check on the generator just in case. It was keeping the lights on and running the heater, and I didn't want any surprises. I grabbed a flashlight and pushed through the deep snow to the small shed behind the cabin. The wind was freezing, biting through my coat, and the snow was so thick it slowed me down. When I got to the shed, my stomach sank. The generator had shut off. At first, I thought it had just run out of gas, but then I saw the problem. The fuel line had been cut, cleanly, like someone used a knife. I stared at it, my heart pounding. There was no way this was an accident. I quickly fixed the line and got the generator running again, then hurried back inside. My fiancée and her mom were sitting by the fire, laughing about something, completely unaware. I didn't say anything to them. I didn't want to scare them, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed louder. The wind groaning against the cabin, the creaks of the wooden beams. It all put me on edge. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just faint crunching sounds, like footsteps in the snow. I told myself it was just the wind moving the snow around, but I couldn't let it go. Quietly, I got out of bed and went to the window. Even in the heavy snowfall, I could see tracks. They came from the woods and stopped near the back of the cabin. My chest tightened. Whoever had messed with the generator wasn't gone. I grabbed the biggest knife from the kitchen and sat in the living room, staring at the door. Hours passed. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't relax. When the sun finally came up, the tracks were gone, buried under fresh snow. I didn't tell my fiancée or her mom. I didn't want to scare them, but I decided to stay up and watch again that night. By evening, I had blocked off every door and window as best as I could. I stayed up, holding the knife, ready for anything. Around midnight, I heard it again, a scratching sound, this time at the back door. I got up slowly, trying to move as quietly as possible. From the kitchen window, I looked out and froze. There was someone crouched by the door. They were bundled up in heavy winter clothes, their face completely covered, working on the lock with something in their hands. My heart raced. They weren't trying to scare us, they were trying to get in. I slammed against the door as hard as I could, yelling to scare them off. They stumbled back, startled, then ran off into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching every window, but they didn't come back. When the sun rose, I told my fiancée and her mom everything. They were terrified but agreed we couldn't stay another night. The storm had finally started to let up, so we decided to pack up and leave, even if it meant walking to the main road for help. Before we left, I went out to check the generator one last time. That's when I saw it. A hunting knife stabbed into the wooden post near the shed. There was a piece of paper pinned under it, with a short message written in shaky letters. "You can't hide forever." We didn't wait around. We grabbed what we could carry and started hiking through the snow. It took hours to reach the road, and when we finally flagged down a passing truck, I felt some relief. But as we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about that note, or the fact that someone had been out there, watching us the whole time. Whoever it was, they had planned this. They knew the storm would trap us, and they waited for the right moment to make their move. The scariest part is that they never seemed in a rush. They weren't just trying to rob us or scare us off. They were patient, like they were waiting for something else. We never went back to that cabin. I don't even know if it's still standing. But sometimes when I think about that weekend, I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to show up, someone who might not get away in time. I was hiding out in a small village deep in the woods, the kind of place where the trees stood so close they almost touched, and the roads were more mud than gravel. I was on the run. My crimes had caught up to me, and I needed to vanish. I found an old cabin on the edge of the village. It looked like no one had lived there in years. The windows were fogged with dirt, the wood was falling apart, and it smelled damp and stale inside. But it was a roof over my head, and that was good enough for now. The days passed slowly, too slowly. Nobody in the village seemed to care that I was there. Or maybe they just acted like they didn't notice me. I spent my time fixing up the cabin and cutting wood for the fire. I tried to stay out of sight, but the nights were the worst. The wind would whistle through the cracks in the walls, and the creaking would make me feel like the cabin was alive. Some nights, I swore I heard footsteps outside. I'd look out the window, but there was never anyone there. One night, I was sitting in the dark, trying to calm my nerves, when I heard something strange. A soft tapping sound coming from under the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some animal, but the sound didn't stop. It was slow, steady, and far too regular to be the wind. It got under my skin, but I told myself it was nothing and went to bed. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that something was under there. The next morning, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and crawled under the cabin. The space was small and cold, and the dirt was damp. It smelled rotten, like something had died down there. I moved the flashlight around, looking for what might be making the noise. I expected to see a raccoon or maybe a possum. Instead, I found an old wooden box, half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years, but it wasn't broken. I opened it. Inside were some old papers, a few photos, and a rusty knife. The photos were of people. Some looked like they lived in the village, and others I didn't recognize. Their faces had been scratched out, and there were dates written on the backs of the photos. The newest date was just a week ago, the same time I came to the village. My stomach dropped. I quickly put the box back and crawled out. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I found. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those scratched out faces. I started to notice things about the villagers, too. How they always seemed to be watching me, even when I thought I was alone. How they never smiled or said hello. I thought I had been hiding, but now it felt like they had been watching me the whole time. On the fifth night, the tapping came back. This time it was louder, and it wasn't just tapping. I heard footsteps, heavy and slow, walking around the cabin. My chest tightened as I grabbed the knife I had taken from the box. I pressed my back against the wall and waited. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Then the front door creaked open. I didn't wait to see who it was. I bolted out the back door and ran into the woods. The cold air hit my face, but I didn't stop. I could hear them behind me, their steps crunching on the leaves. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I kept running until I saw the main road. Relief washed over me when I saw the headlights of a truck parked on the side of the road. But when I got closer, I stopped. The truck wasn't there to help me. Its engine was on, and a man stepped out, his face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see him clearly, but I knew he wasn't a stranger. He was one of them. I turned to run back into the woods, but I froze. The villagers were already there, standing between me and the trees. Their faces were blank, their eyes cold. I don't know how they knew who I was or what I had done, but it didn't matter. The way they stood there, silent and still, made my skin crawl. They didn't need to say anything. Their message was clear. I wasn't leaving that village. The last thing I remember was the sound of footsteps getting closer. Then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in the cabin, tied to a chair. The box was sitting in front of me, open. Inside was a new photo. My photo. My face scratched out. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was their next target. It was a cold, dark night on border duty. My cabin stood alone on a lonely hill, surrounded by miles of empty land. The only light came from a weak bulb outside the cabin and the pale moon hanging in the sky. The radio crackled now and then, but mostly it was silent, a silence that seemed to press down on me. The cabin was plain, with just a small bed, an old desk with a dusty map, and a heater that barely worked. I had been here for 2 weeks, and while I had gotten used to being alone, something about the place felt off. The quietness out there wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of stillness that made you feel like you didn't belong. Around midnight, I went outside to do a quick check. The cold stung my face, and the snow crunched under my boots. I scanned the area with my binoculars. Nothing, just miles of snow-covered land that seemed to go on forever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination. I had felt it before, and it was always nothing. At least that's what I thought. As I turned to head back inside, I noticed something near the tree line, about 200 meters away. It was just a flicker of movement, like a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze and raised my binoculars again, focusing on the spot. But there was nothing there. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a fox or a deer, maybe. Once inside, I checked the locks twice and made sure my rifle was close by. The wind outside was loud, and the cabin's walls creaked under the pressure. I tried to keep busy by writing in my logbook, but my eyes kept going back to the small window. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps in the snow. At about 2 a.m., the motion sensor alarm went off. My heart raced as I grabbed my rifle and rushed to the door. The sensor was near the same tree line where I thought I'd seen movement earlier. I flipped on the floodlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just the same empty land. I looked through my rifle scope, my hands shaking a little. Then I saw it. A person, crouched low, moving toward the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, sticking to the shadows. My stomach tightened. This wasn't an animal. I shouted a warning, but they didn't stop. Instead, they darted to the side, out of the floodlight's range. I stayed at the door, my finger on the trigger, listening. The wind had stopped completely, leaving the night too quiet. Then, I heard it, a loud thud from the back of the cabin. My chest tightened. Someone was out there, testing the walls, maybe trying to find a way in. I moved to the back window slowly, keeping low. I peeked out. Nothing. But then I heard breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. It was faint but close, just on the other side of the wall. I froze, holding my breath, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might give me away. The breathing stopped, and after a long, tense moment, I heard footsteps. They were slow, steady, moving away from the cabin. I didn't relax. I stayed alert, gripping my rifle until my hands hurt. Minutes passed, then hours. There was no more sound. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside to check the area. The snow didn't lie. Footprints circled the cabin several times, and I saw spots where someone had tried to pry open the windows. What scared me most was a single set of boot prints leading away from the cabin, back toward the trees. I followed them for a while, but they stopped suddenly, like whoever made them had just disappeared. I reported everything to my superiors, but they didn't take it seriously. They said it was probably just a trespasser who got scared and ran off. Maybe they were right, maybe not. That night I couldn't rest. Every little sound made me jump. The wind, the creaks of the cabin, even my own breathing felt too loud. I kept staring out the window, waiting to see that figure again. But nothing happened. The next morning, I checked the snow again. The footprints from the night before were gone, but new ones had appeared, closer this time. They stopped just outside my cabin door. There were no signs of someone leaving. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching me. They were letting me know they could get closer. And I knew without a doubt they'd be back. It was my first time visiting my gym partner, Sergeant, at his grandma's cabin. The place was way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods. The drive had been long, and it was getting dark by the time we got there. The cabin wasn't anything special, just old, falling apart, with a small porch and a broken fence. The air felt cold, and the silence around the place was strange. There were no sounds of animals or even wind. It was just quiet, too quiet. We unpacked our stuff and got comfortable. The cabin smelled old and damp, and the floor creaked every time you moved. It wasn't until it got dark that things started to feel weird. The wind picked up, making the trees outside shake, but the way the branches moved felt wrong. It was like they were scraping against the windows, almost like fingers. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't stop feeling like something was out there, watching. Around midnight, I got up to grab a drink of water from the kitchen. The cabin was pitch black, only lit by a dim lamp near the couch. As I walked through the living room, I saw something strange. There was a shadow flickering near the front door. It wasn't just the wind. It looked like someone was standing outside, watching us. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. I tried to listen, but it was dead silent. I slowly walked over to the door and peeked through the curtains. There was nothing there, just the trees moving in the wind. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft scratching sounds, like something was scraping at the walls. Felt like it was getting closer. Around 3 a.m., I heard a loud bang come from outside. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, shining the light into the dark woods. For a second, I thought I saw something moving. Then the beam caught two bright eyes staring back at me. I froze. Those eyes didn't blink or move. They just stared, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Before I could react, the eyes disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest, too scared to move. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but I didn't. I turned off the flashlight, walked back inside, locked the door, and sat by the window watching the trees. The rest of the night was quiet, but the fear never left. The next morning, Sergeant didn't seem worried at all. He acted like nothing happened. But as we were packing up to leave, I noticed something strange. There were long, deep scratches along the cabin's wooden walls, right by the door. They were fresh, as if something had tried to get in. The marks looked new, like whatever was out there had been waiting for us. My stomach dropped. I wasn't just hearing things. Something had been there watching us all night. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The woods were still and quiet, but I knew I'd never feel safe there again. Something had been out there. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure it was waiting for us to leave. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it's still out there watching. I don't think it will ever stop. I had been staying at a small cabin for a few days, way out near the United States-Canada border. The place was really isolated, surrounded by thick trees and an old graveyard not too far away. The graveyard always felt a little off, but I never thought much of it. It was quiet out there, the kind of peace I needed to get away from everything. There wasn't a soul around for miles. One afternoon, I decided to go for a walk, get some fresh air, and look around. I figured I'd check out the graveyard since it was so close. The headstones were old, some hard to read because the names had faded with time. It didn't make sense why anyone would bury people out here, in the middle of nowhere. The place had obviously been forgotten for years, the stones half covered by grass and vines that had grown wild. I walked around the edge of the graveyard. The wind was blowing through the trees, making everything even quieter. It was the kind of quiet that starts to mess with your head, even if you try not to let it. The cold in the air made me feel like I needed to hurry up. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows were stretching longer across the ground. I decided it was time to head back before it got too dark. But just as I was about to turn, something caught my eye. There was a figure standing at the far end of the graveyard, right next to one of the trees. My heart stopped. It was hard to tell what it was, but it looked like a person. It didn't move, just stood there, staring ahead. I froze in place. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I didn't waste any time. I turned quickly and started walking back to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I should be moving faster. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, the air cold and tight in my lungs. I glanced over my shoulder once, just once, but the figure was still there, unmoving. I didn't look back again. My steps got faster. My feet felt like they were dragging, but I forced myself to move. Once inside the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I checked all the windows, making sure they were secure. The cabin felt too small, too exposed now. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen. Maybe I was just freaking out. I told myself. It wasn't like it was a ghost or anything, but something didn't feel right. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see someone standing there again. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept staring out the window, watching the trees sway in the wind, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. It was almost like the whole thing had been in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The next morning, I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things quickly, just wanting to get out of there. As I drove past the graveyard, I slowed down, thinking I might take one last look. My eyes went straight to the ground. There were fresh footprints, deep in the dirt, leading from the far end of the graveyard to the trees behind it. They were recent, like someone had just walked there. The ground wasn't soft, so the prints hadn't been there long. They were clear, fresh, like whoever made them had just passed through. The snow hadn't fully covered them, so I could see them clearly. I had no idea who could have made them, but I didn't want to know. I didn't stop to look closer. I didn't want to be anywhere near that graveyard anymore. The drive away from that place felt endless. I didn't look back until I was miles down the road, and when I finally did, I swear I saw something move between the trees at the edge of the graveyard. I couldn't be sure, but the shape looked like it was standing still, watching me leave. My hands were sweating on the wheel, my heart racing again. I didn't go back. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But there was something about those footprints, something about the way the figure had just stood there, that I couldn't forget. A few weeks later, I saw something strange in the news. Another cabin up near the border had been broken into. The thing that caught my attention wasn't the break-in. It was the strange detail in the report. Footprints had been found near the cabin, leading away from a graveyard to the woods. I didn't need to read more. I didn't want to know who or what had been following me that day. I had been looking forward to this cabin trip for months. The peace, the chance to get away from everything. I rented an old, small cabin in the woods, far from any roads. It was surrounded by thick trees, and the air was still and heavy. No neighbors for miles, just the sound of leaves rustling and the occasional bird call. The first day was great. I unpacked, made a fire, and enjoyed the quiet. I even went for a long walk around the place, checking out a stream nearby and walking down some overgrown trails. Everything seemed perfect, maybe too perfect. The quiet felt almost unnatural, but I shook it off. As the sun began to set, the sky turned orange behind the trees, casting long shadows. I made dinner and relaxed, then went to bed. That's when things started to feel wrong. The silence wasn't calming anymore. It felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I could hear my heartbeat, loud in my chest. Every little sound from the cabin, the wind blowing, the snapping of twigs outside, felt too loud. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. At first, it was distant, like footsteps far away. It sounded like someone was walking around the cabin. I froze. There were no roads nearby, no paths, no reason for anyone to be out here. I grabbed a flashlight and peeked through the curtains. I saw nothing but the dark outline of trees moving in the wind. Then I heard it again, closer this time, the sound of leaves crunching, like someone was walking just outside the cabin, just out of sight. My heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but I knew better. Animals don't make that sound. It was the sound of boots crunching dry leaves, like a person walking. I sat there in the dark, listening. The sound stopped for a moment. Then the door creaked just slightly. I hadn't locked it. Panic hit me. I grabbed my keys and rushed to lock the door, checking all the windows too. But as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The air felt too thick, like it was pressing against me. Every minute felt like an hour. I stayed up the rest of the night, eyes darting to every corner of the room, waiting for something. When morning came, everything seemed normal. No footprints, no signs of anyone being out there. But I could feel something was wrong. I packed my things, ready to leave, when I noticed something strange near the edge of the property. There was an old notebook, half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years. I picked it up and flipped through it. The pages were messy, filled with writing, but one thing stood out: a list of cabin names, each crossed off. At the bottom of the page, in big, bold letters, "Don't let them see you leave." My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. Someone had been watching me, and they knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't waste any more time. I threw my stuff in the car and drove off, trying not to look back. But as I passed the narrow road leading away from the cabin, I saw something in the trees. Someone standing there, just watching me drive away. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure: I wasn't meant to be there. That cabin, it wasn't just a cabin. It was a place where people disappeared. And whoever was out there, they were still watching. They had been waiting, and they would be waiting again. I couldn't escape. Not really. As I sped away, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone in the car. The weight in the air felt heavier now, suffocating. The trees outside blurred past, but I felt like something was following me, keeping pace just out of sight. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to know. I didn't even stop until I was miles away from that cabin. The whole time, though, I kept thinking of that notebook and the note at the bottom. Don't let them see you leave. That feeling never left me, and it still hasn't. No matter where I go, I feel like someone is always watching, always waiting, like they know I'm trying to get away, but they'll never let me.